Talk about real love now, or when you know it's real love, or is it not, especially if you're online. And a few weeks ago I saw GAA catfish trending on Twitter. I hadn't a clue what it meant, so eventually last weekend I worked it out because I listened to a podcast by the comedy duo The Two Johnnies. One of them, Johnny B, had worked out that he had been catfished by someone, and then after he had worked that out and spoke publicly about it, this led to over 40 other fellas who had been catfished by the same person contacting him to share their stories and experience. So this has nothing to do with Gaelic games, by the way, but a few high profile players have been unwittingly part of this story and they've not been publicly identified. So we wanted to delve a little deeper into the subject of catfishing as we continue to live more and more of our lives out online and not in real life. Can anyone be catfished? What is it? What motivates someone to do this? How does it feel to be catfished? Can it be prevented? And are social media platforms doing enough to prevent it? I spoke to Louise Carroll, who is a consultant psychologist, and Dr. Kevin Kern from Ulster University. And Kevin starts the conversation by explaining what catfishing is.
Well, it's deception. It's where you create fictional persons, and usually these are accounts, identities on social networking services, and then you target specific victims. Really, it's just fake. It's fake accounts, and then backed up by lies and deceit, and trying to then, whichever, whether it's for financial gain or whether it's for romantic or wish fulfillment in some way. But that's the key to it, really, is using these fake accounts and just deceiving people.
And how does someone know that they have been catfished?
Generally, if they're not willing to meet you, or to send you video calls or whatever else, depending if this is someone who's catfishing you in a romantic way, bringing you along, of course. But if they don't come on the video, which anyone should do after a few days, really. If you're on a dating app or whatever else, or whatever, you should be able to speak to someone, or at least even speak to them on audio, but even better on video to prove, because there are so many accounts out there which are fake. There really are, and I've seen it. I see it more than most people because I kind of manage Facebook accounts, and I've seen the ones that come in and they're fake, and you can't tell straight away. I know once I get the messages coming in, so I just leave it. But then I know exactly, who's fake or not.
And with that level of deception, is it illegal?
Well, it'd be illegal if you blackmail someone. It'd be illegal if you ask for money, if you cheated someone. The romantic thing where someone is dragging someone along, and maybe that they're a different sex even, or a different age completely. I mean, that's for a jury to decide. I mean, that's a grey area, really, because really it's, there. But of course, it's illegal in the sense that the account should be taken down by the social media network that it's on, really. So if you ever feel that, of course, you want to follow up, keep the account in case you want to speak to the police, but inform the platform, because that will make it harder for them to do it to someone else, and at least they can check them out.
Well, the reason we're talking about catfishing today on the programme is because of the Two Johnnies GAA catfish story, which they have spoken about at length on their podcast. So I'll direct you to that podcast to cover that story. But Louise Carroll joins me today as well. Louise is a musician and a consultant psychologist. Louise, I heard you on the Two Johnnies podcast talking about this catfish story. My jaw just kept dropping to the ground, and I thought it could drop no more, and then it dropped another level with every development that came along. Could you possibly give me the story in a nutshell and an assessment of what you understand has happened here?
So the story in a nutshell, if I can recall, is that Johnny B connected with this girl online on Instagram, and they started to message back and forth, and he found her attractive and he was interested in pursuing something with her, and it seemed to be likewise. So this started to grow and on for a couple of weeks. Every time they went to organise a date to meet up in real life, in person, something would happen. There would be some kind of accident in the family, or there would be some kind of tragedy, meaning she couldn't meet with him. Mm-hmm. So that happened a few times. The rest gets very, very complex. She was called Cora, who Johnny was connecting with. And the friend Nikki, not her real name, would post things on social media. And they would be with GAA players. And this is why it's been termed the GAA catfish. So there seemed to have been relationships, and what looked like legitimate relationships with these footballers. So there was evidence of that. That's at least what it looked like, because there she was with these inter-county football players. And there was no really reason to believe that there was anything incoherent about this, other than every time something would be planned to meet, she wouldn't do it, or she would not show up, including being at a pub where she said she was. They arrived, the two Johnnies arrived, and she wasn't there. And friends sort of put their hands in the air, not knowing where she was either. So lots of really odd behaviour in real time, but then would apologise profusely back on social media, and it would continue.
They found out that this person, it was all false, and it was all a lie, and a web of lies, and lots of fake accounts. So what motivates someone to do this in the first place, Louise?
It's maybe start by saying that social media in general is a very aspirational universe. And the potential for anonymity on social media actually decreases people's moral code. And when you think about there's a scale or there's a spectrum on social media of what is the truth, right? Reality is consistently being edited, and any individual can plan and edit themselves online, and we can't do that in real time as easily. So it can feel safe, and it can feel like a relief, it can feel protected, and it can feel aspirational to create a persona, first and foremost. Secondly, you may, if you have gone to these lengths, put yourself in a position where you're connecting with people, you're creating relationships that you don't maybe perceive yourself as being able to do in real life. So you've literally created a universe of possibility that you felt or perceived that you couldn't do in real time.
In that sense, then, is that this false world, does that bring in vulnerability into the story? Because you mightn't be deserving of this world, this false world that you have created for yourself.
Well, your perception is you perhaps won't ever attain it in real life.
Okay.
And in this sort of reality that you create online, there's a feeling of joy in that. There's a feeling of power. The catfish is connecting with people who are maybe on public platforms and is commanding attention, through their behaviors. And that is intoxicating for them to wield that kind of power. Yeah. But, you're right in mentioning vulnerability, right? Because it does, and it is born out of a place of vulnerability. It is born out of a place of not enoughness, the feeling of not being enough, the feeling of not being able to just be themselves, and for that to be okay. And for that to be warranting and deserving of real-time relationships and connection.
Because in the case of the GAA catfish, it's been suspected this woman's been doing this for years, using various aliases. And I couldn't work out whether she was to be pitied or scorned because of that sense of vulnerability, that aspiring to a life that she possibly dreams she could never have. But then some of her behaviours were bordering on sinister as well. And I suppose it's back to the point that Kevin made about this world of catfishing being quite deceptive.
Absolutely. It's rooted in deception. But you see, and I'll come back to something around our development, our growth. When we're young, when we're growing up, when we're children, when we're teenagers, how often are we lying and getting away with it?
Yeah.
Right. So what's our framework for development and growth when we're growing up? Are we pulled up on something when we lie? And it's so natural for humans to do that when they're toddlers. Did you take the chocolate? No. Right. But there's chocolate over your face. So
yeah.
It's a human instinct to try and get out of trouble. But are there consequences when you're growing up? And if there are consequences, you learn that's not okay. You learn then to be more aligned with the truth and to stay connected with the truth. But if there are not consequences in your life, then you learn that actually it's okay to lie. I can get what I want when I lie.
Yeah,
and then you're more likely to actually do that more and more and more, and in more serious and more sinister ways, the way you've mentioned.
And if not challenged, then that behaviour becomes more normalised. And if you're not being challenged and there aren't consequences, sure, why would you stop?
That's right. That's exactly right. And, I always talk about who are the enablers, in someone's life when I encounter something like this. Who's enabling you to do this? And there are people in this person's life, in relation to the two Johnny story, and there are people in her life who it seems are enabling this behaviour as well. And that's where I drew attention to that in the actual podcast, because can you help a catfish? Yes, you can, right? Because we can stop enabling that behaviour. We can stop excusing that behavior and explaining it away. And it's not just a joke and it's not just fun.
Yeah.
You know, it may have started out that way, but you're actually harming people.
Exactly. And that brings me to the other person who has engaged with the catfish. Why do people engage? What about them?
I mean, on the one hand, yes, a place of vulnerability, but also very natural, right? So we're human.
Yeah.
We have certain attractions to certain people. And when that seems to land on our doorstep, it's good that Johnny has a friend, Johnny, to point out when things look too good to be true, right? Because
They
we can
usually
get
are.
sucked. Yes, right. And we can get sucked into the idea. And what a better place to get sucked into a fantasy and fall down a spiral when it's social media, when it's not actually in real face-to-face life, because there's so much space and time for us to fill in the gaps of what's true. And when we are left with that amount of time to fill in the gaps, we create another world. We do it ourselves. You know, we fill in the gaps of who this person is, what they're like, what's their personality. We get little snippets and chunks, and then we fill in the rest. And we create the idea of a life, you know, that looks hugely romantic and exciting with this person. That's a very natural thing to do, but we do it even more so when we come from a place of vulnerability. Maybe we've just broken up with somebody. You know, maybe we really feel like we need to be seen and that we need to be taken care of in that moment.
How do you get over the sense of embarrassment then, Louise? You know, because when you realise you've been catfished and someone has done this to you, someone has deceived you in this way, you know, it can be quite embarrassing and, difficult to get over.
Yeah, it is. And particularly, like you say, if you're coming at it first from a place of being on the back foot, of feeling like, you were looking for comfort and you thought you had hit the jackpot, you know, and you've told everybody and everybody's aware of it. And then suddenly it's actually just this balloon that popped and it never existed. You know, the person actually never existed. And there's some shame with that. And depending on where you're at in your life, you know, some people might turn on themselves and say, I should have seen it. You know, it's my fault. And how did I do that? And such would never have fallen for that. And we can really go hard on ourselves. For others, it can actually really bring them down. Their mood can go down. They can become anxious and quite mistrustful of people in the future. And that can prevent them from actually forming relationships. You know, it can really impact quite severely depending on the extent of it. And bearing in mind, you know, Johnny experienced this for 6 weeks, I think it was. But, you know, for some people, these relationships can go on for years. You know, there's quite shocking stories of how these catfishing relationships went on for years.
I can believe that fellas thought they were in a real relationship with someone after 6 months and they'd only ever been chatting to them online and they'd never met. That blew my mind. But, you know, Kevin's still with us, Professor Kevin Curran, listening to Louise talk through the psychology of catfishing. And, you know, it's massive on both sides, Kevin. And I suppose prevention is better than cure. Louise has mentioned multiple times there that this is an aspirational world. So, you know, what precautions can be taken?
Don't go online.
Is it that bad?
No, it's not. Because a catfishing account it's not so much a bot. It actually is someone, but they're faking it. Yeah. So even if the best Instagram, team members were analyzing accounts like that, they would just see normal trends. A person posting this IP address here and there, the photos seem real. There's no, so they could only ever have discovered a catfish account after the fact.
Is a reverse selfie something that we could do, or is that a deterrent to catfishing?
It doesn't always work. Google is one of the places you go for reverse image search, and it doesn't have all the profile pics from all the social media platforms. So people set up the accounts also. Sometimes they're quite lazy. They've gone to Google and got the images, and then they put the image up, so it's easy to do reverse. But if they have simply taken a photo from somewhere in an album or something as well, that's unlikely to appear in the existing database as well. So it doesn't work in all cases. It is part of our life. Look at it. Otherwise, we're not going to shut down Instagram or Facebook tomorrow. We know we're dealing with the problems as we go. There's a lot to be done, and we need to put, we have regulations now which are getting tighter in place, but we just have to kind of clear it up again. There's a lot of fake bots and fake accounts out there and people doing this, but until we have a license for the internet, literally an ID, which is, there is no barriers to entries to creating accounts online until we have some universal ID, which will never happen, I think.
There's an awful lot to unpack in that, isn't there? You just heard Dr. Kevin Curran from Ulster University and Louise Carroll, a consultant psychologist, talk about catfishing. The GAA catfish story itself is really something else, and it's nothing to do with the sport, by the way. But we're talking about catfishing. It's being deceived online, whether emotionally or financially. And I think the moral of the story and the advice that I took out of that conversation was, if you're connecting with someone online, meet with them in person as soon as possible, and then you'll be able to work it out very, very quickly. So don't invest emotionally with someone. If you're lonely and if you're feeling vulnerable, just don't do it, because it could end in tears. And for more on Louise, you can follow her on Instagram at Louise Carroll, and that's Louise with a Z, CARROLL. And you can also go to louiseprismtherapyonline.com to find out more about her consultant psychology services. 7 minutes to 4 o'clock this